Hi, it's Erika of Grapefruit and Gardenia Designs and the Knit Kind podcast. And today I'm going to expand a little bit more on what I spoke about in a very recent short video about gauge. And I'm going to do that in the context of my latest pattern release, which is 700 Fence Posts Cowl. And I'm also going to do it in the context of a whip that I have, which is the Dogstar sweater by TinCanKnits. As always, you can find more about my projects that I'm speaking about on the podcast on Ravelry. My username on Ravelry is knittyelf40, and you can find my designs under Erika Field's pattern store on Ravelry. So I don't forget, I am wearing my shoulder season. I love this design under a jean jacket. And today, even though it's February, in Massachusetts, it happens to be about 54 degrees outside. So it was perfect to throw on my jean jacket, shoulder season underneath. You can see it cuts off. Call it a cowl, call it a dickie, call it whatever you want. It's a dickie. But call it a cowl if you're more comfortable. So it is mosaic knitting. It is done in 2 colors in a DK or light worsted weight yarn. This sample is in So Happy Jane in a pairing from her yarn club in October of 2022, I think. But it worked beautifully with all of her perfect pairings. It would work beautifully with Malabrigo Rios, which some of my testers knitted it in. And really, as I've said with many of my designs, with so many different yarns that you could substitute, whether you're going to a big box store or you're going to a local yarn shop and you have those perfect pairings, or you have those skeins where you bought one skein of speckled or hand-dyed yarn on a vacation, or at a fiber festival, a farm yarn. It works great with all of those. It is written in a couple of different sizes, and it has some really neat techniques. So down here is Swedish weave. I've talked about it before. I won't go through all of them, but all mosaic or sections of single color, a really small section of short rows if that's something you want to learn more about, a little bit of raglan shaping here, and that's it. It's a lot of fun. I hope you'll check it out. So going more into gauge. Well, what I touched on last time was how a lot of times, and I know this is a hot topic right now, people will say, I've got a DK weight yarn, I'm looking for a DK weight pattern. Or I've got a bulky yarn, bulky pattern, fingering pattern, etc. And what we touched on and what many others are talking about is not getting tied into the weight yarn you have and matching it with that weight of a pattern. It is a great place to start, and if you're a beginner, don't let your head spin too much. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But you can expand your choices and your options if you don't solely look for that. And if you look at that and it doesn't feel right, you don't have to feel limited to that weight of yarn for that pattern. So let's go back a couple steps and say what we mean by that. Well, we'll just use a middle weight yarn. So let's say you're looking at a worsted weight yarn or number 4 yarn, and you're trying to match that to a pattern. Well, first thing you do is you look up worsted weight patterns. You might find a worsted weight pattern that is 16 stitches and 4 inches, and you might find one that is 24 stitches and 4 inches. And it might be totally reasonable that you could make either of those with the yarn that you have. But let's stop for a second. You're swatching, you're trying to get gauge. Let's say you have a problem getting gauge. Either with your yarn, 24 stitches in 4 inches is a fabric that is so tight it's not going to move. You're probably not going to want to wear that in a nice sweater that you want to move with your body. Or with your yarn, you knit it at 16 stitches in 4 inches, and you say, I could poke my finger right through these holes, and that's not what I want for my sweater. I want it to be more compact. And when you do your swatch, you find out that you're really happy with that yarn in 4 inches having 20 stitches. It might not be the best fit for either of those patterns, or perhaps neither of those patterns is what you're actually looking to knit. So when you are thinking about gauge, thinking about the weight of yarn, and thinking about matching it to a pattern, remember that it's not just a very static formula, that there's a little bit more to it. So we talked about that last time, and I'm going to give you some examples. So I am currently knitting the TinCanKnits Dogstar sweater for my son. It is a bottom-up construction, and it is a colorwork yoke. So you're actually supposed to start with the sleeves. I actually started with the body and then did sleeves, but tip, if you start with the sleeves, you can kind of use them as your gauge swatch too. So that depends. Second sidebar, a lot of times on small circumference knitting, your gauge is not the same as it's going to be for the body. So that might not be the best thing. Throwing in those tips as we go. Coming fast and furious. So this is the body. For me, I did do a very small gauge swatch for this. Okay, this is smaller than a gauge swatch I would do for most adult sweaters, but I had a really good sense of what I wanted to do. And so the yarn I'm using for the main color, my son picked out, it's his sweater, is the Ultra Alpaca Natural, which is a 50% superfine alpaca and a 50% Peruvian wool. It is not dye, although it does have a dye lot, but it says all undyed fiber. So, you know, a shearing lot perhaps. And I'm using it with the making tracks. And I did this, it's plenty wide, it's not as long, and that will factor in. But I'll tell you how I'll adjust as I go and how will know what I'm doing. So this sweater was written for a DK, I think it was written for a DK yarn as opposed to a worsted weight yarn. But my son is a growing boy, as they say. And I, number one, was okay with the sweater just being overall larger than the dimensions. However, he is on the cusp between a size 6 to 8 and an 8 to 10. He certainly needs more length. He is a tall boy, but he is a very slim boy. So a couple of things. One, my gauge was more like a worsted weight gauge. I think maybe 21 stitches and 4 inches after or before blocking, and maybe closer to 20. And now for those of you who do use yarn with labels like these, that is either a big box or a commercially produced yarn, let's just take a look. I don't often look at this, but on here it says the knitting gauge on a US 8 needle or a 5mm needle would be expected to come out at 20 stitches per 4 inches and 26 rows per 4 inches when they are feeling like they're getting the fabric that you would want from this yarn. Guideline. So I did my gauge swatch. I compared it to what was in the pattern. And what I decided to do for him was to knit the size 6/8 with a slightly looser or larger gauge with a larger yarn, thicker yarn, and therefore probably a very comparable fabric. So I am following the number of stitches for the size 6 to 8. I am following the length for the size 8 to 10. And because that is just knitting to a certain length, I can do that very easily. So my body has been knitted to 15 inches from hem to underarm. My sleeves similarly have been knitted to 15 inches. And when both sleeves are done, I will be joining in the round and knitting the yoke. Now there's the one place that sometimes people forget about when they're doing these kind of modifications. So what's going to happen with the yoke? Well, I need to check my row gauge and the yoke depth, because in this particular pattern going bottom up, if I need to add for the yoke depth, then I'm going to need to add some rounds before I start the color work. If I need to subtract for the yoke depth, then I'm going to need to figure out which rounds I want to remove. Does that make sense? So my row gauge matters. And it matters with the yarn substitution as well as this looking at the 2 different sizes and where I'm going to land. And what I want to make sure is that the yoke depth is neither too long, in which case it will be down here and create that situation where you don't have a nice snug fit in the underarm. And I definitely don't want it to be too short, meaning the arm side, or where he's sticking his arm through there, is not going to have enough depth for his arm, if I'm saying this all correctly. But you know, I don't want that to be too short and have this nice long sweater and then a yoke depth that's so short that it's like pulling so it doesn't fit right. So there are a couple different considerations there. And I might not be saying that totally right because I haven't gotten to that part, so I'm kind of thinking it through on the fly. But the bottom line is yoke depth does matter. And that would be the same thing if you were going top down. It's just that you might catch it sooner because you'd be trying on that way as opposed to trying on this way. So if you're doing top down sweater, not only are you trying to get the width correct if you're modifying, but the row gauge and therefore the yoke depth similarly will matter. You don't want to cut it off too soon or too late if you don't want that kind of fit where you're way down here where your join is. So that is a real world example. I'll keep you posted as I go, but so far so good. And I think a lot of times that's what people think about when they think about it's okay to knit a pattern with a slightly different gauge as long as I know my end result. And yes, I know that when you're measuring for sweater fit, upper bust tends to be more accurate than full bust, but just for the sake of this gauge discussion, let's talk full bust. So if I'm knitting a sweater, and I usually pivot off of that 40, it's almost always the third size in on most people's grading charts, and often around a 40-inch bust. And if I know that I'm going to be a little bit on the smaller side, I figure out all my measurements and am I okay with 38 inches based on my number of stitches in 4 inches? And if it's in the other direction, am I going to be okay with a fit if it's 42 inches? So you kind of base off of that. And I think when people start doing this, even though it's a big project and it's a sweater, they're a little bit more comfortable because they have that understanding of this one particular measurement and how that is going to change. And then similarly, how it will change for your sleeves and so on. And it's the nuances where people get a little bit more hesitant about doing that. So let's talk accessories and why it's not necessarily something that you ignore for accessories either. Now, on the one hand, people are a little less concerned about getting gauge, but I can tell you whether it's a piece like this that I'm wearing or it's, I mean, obviously a hat or gloves you want to fit better. Even a full shawl, right? Like sometimes you just might not want it to end up so long or so deep, or you might want it deeper or longer. So there are considerations there. For me, a lot of times it's the ease around the neck. Even when I'm designing, because my neck is smaller proportionally to my body, I need to consider what would I do to modify, and then how would I write this for more of a standard body size. So I said we were going to talk about this in the context of my 700 Fence Posts Cowl, and that's what I'm going to do next. This is the original DK version. This is the prototype. As I mentioned when I did the full episode, there's basically 4 different views because as you turn it, every side is different. Even though it is a seamless cowl, but because of the construction, you knit essentially a triangle shawl, join it in the middle and knit in the round, and then a triangle shawl again. But you don't end up with anything to seam at the end. So this prototype was done in a DK weight yarn but really light worsted in terms of what you usually think of as gauge and the weight of the yarn. It is 231 yards to 100 grams. So a little bit more than that typical, maybe 210 to 220, but not so much more, not 260 or 280. It is organic merino. It has some nice drape to it. And I knitted at a stockinette gauge of about 17 stitches, which is a little bit looser. Now, you know, there is mosaic knitting in here, and there's mosaic knitting that does kind of pull in and make a denser fabric. So that's part of the reason I was looking for the looser gauge in a stockinette, because the majority of this is not in stockinette, not even close. So by getting a little bit looser there, it's gonna just give you a nice movable fabric here. Okay, so what happens? I do the DK version, and because I designed this specifically with the So Happy Jane Perfect Pairings yarn in mind, I know that a lot of people who are in the club and who are fans of the yarn, even if they're not in the club, there's the DK weight and there's the fingering weight. And those are the two most popular. There's certainly sport weights and there's bulky weights, and we'll get into that. But DK, light worsted, and fingering, and I would almost even say fingering / sport. You could do light fingering, you could do fingering, heavy fingering, sport, and it's gonna translate. So my first question was, what happens if I just knit the same pattern with a different weight yarn? And I knew that probably wouldn't be the solution, but I wanted to start there in terms of thinking through how I was going to adapt the pattern. So when I was writing it, one of the things I put in the instructions was what to do if you got to the point where you were joining in the round and you felt like it was going to be too small. And there's a modification in the pattern that tells you how you can make it larger in the DK version. It's going to require more yarn, but it's very doable. And you can also swap in yarn, which we'll talk about in a second. So the first thing I did is I took fingering weight yarn, and in fact, this is a pairing where the one that has the greenish color here is actually a light fingering, although it's not a huge difference. But that one is a yarn that is discontinued anyhow, but the turquoisey blue here is the cyan from Malabrigo Sock. So basically I paired a light fingering and a fingering, and I started following the same pattern as the DK version. And I didn't worry about gauge first, I just worried about a fabric that I liked. So I have a fabric that's pretty flowy, but not overly so, not hugely airy. And what I did is I followed the same exact pattern, except I followed the modification for additional width and length. It would give me additional width and length with DK yarn on those needles. Now, for comparison, I'm going to hold these up on top of each other. And actually, I guess I should go this way. You can see the fingering weight yarn after blocking. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to hold it this way. They're almost the same size. I guess that's what I'm getting at. I wanted to show you which one was smaller on top. But as you can see, in this one, the DK one is just a little bit longer, but when you hold them up, they're basically the same width. This one has more stitches in it, more rows, more rounds, but it does not make a huge difference in terms of the final dimensions. And that has to do, obviously, with gauge. So then what happened? Well, I liked that, but it wasn't exactly what I wanted in terms of putting out a pattern. I decided I did not want to put out one pattern and say, you can use this pattern for DK or fingering, and here's what's going to happen. I really wanted a specific fingering weight pattern, and I did not know how much extra work that was going to be until I really started getting into it. What I decided to do was to make it very similar, but you can see already how much more there is to this one. There is, in addition to the increased width and length, there is also an additional section before joining in the round, additional section after splitting, after you're in the round, and more rows in the round. And because of the changes, see, this is, when you might be thinking, oh, it's so easy for a designer, you just switch it over to one weight to another weight, add in a few more sections, and you're done. Except sometimes you don't think it all through, especially if you design the way I do, which is not all on paper first. I'm trying to get better about that in terms of just being able to do it. But my process often ends up being on the needles, and there are certain things that, oh yes, well now that I have that extra round in there, it's gonna change the way that the even and the odd stitches are, and something might not align exactly the same. So it truly ended up being its own pattern. If you knit both of them, it's gonna feel very similar. But when you're in there trying to put together the pattern for people, there's a little bit more to it than just simply writing it for another weight yarn. What happened when I did this is I thought a lot about how this could be a great pattern for minis or for scraps, in addition to for two beautiful complementary skeins. So this particular one I did with the majority of a Pride bundle from Molly Girl Yarns. She is on a medical break right now, so you won't be able to get new yarn from her. And so really when I put out this fingering weight pattern, which will happen at the end of this week. I'm not sure when the video will come out, but the fingering weight pattern, my fingers are crossed that I'll have that out March 1st, I hope, which is Friday of this week. And I thought I'd show how so many of us have either scraps that work beautifully together or mini bundles that we have and we don't know what to do with. And of course the 2 skeins. So you can do this with minis as well. And in the end, yes, you will have some more ends to weave in, but it is by no means so much work that you just can't even think about doing it. And now what I will do is I'm going to hold up the 2 fingering weight versions on top of each other so you can see the size difference. Okay, so now this fingering weight version has additional width, a little bit, not tons of additional width, but some, and length. And what that does is the suggested styling that I have for this cowl is to wear it folded in on itself so that you can have, and I've inserted pictures before. I'm gonna try to make this video maybe without a whole bunch of editing. So if you wanna see what it looks like styled, look at the pictures in Ravelry. This one will be coming out, like I said, the end of this week, and the DK version is already out. And you'll see that it sort of has this look of like folding on itself where you can still see all the colors, you can still see all the stitches, but it has, I think of it as like a gauzy look. I loved those cowls and scarves for so many years that like they just look windswept when you're by the ocean. Or you can wear them in those seasons where you're not freezing cold, you're not trying to stay so warm and woolly. You want a little bit of breeze coming through, but you might have a chill on your neck. So it's really nice for that. And so this is the official fingering weight pattern in terms of the stitches that will give you the length and the width. In terms of the yarn you use, it is really knitter's choice. I designed the prototype in DK with So Happy Jane yarn and wanted to have a yarn or a pattern that people could use with her fingering weight yarn as well. So the suggested yarn is the So Happy Jane. I've test knitted it, like I said, with Malabrigo sock, and a number of test knitters have done all kinds of different fingering weight yarns. And in terms of fiber content, I think probably a lot of wool. There were a few blends for sure. Some people have done it in single ply, people have done it in, 4-ply, so 2-ply. There's not so much that I would say lean toward one or the other. Use beautiful yarns, that's what I would say. I mean, knitting on the bias, it will matter a little bit with like a single ply yarn, but for an accessory like this, I think there's a lot of width, that's a terrible word to use for this, but there's a lot of sort of leeway in what you can choose for what yarn you want to use. And this one, I really enjoyed using minis, and I brought with me my little pile of, I've talked about it so many times, my Winnie the Pooh calendar from So Happy Jane this year. It's overflowing, so I don't know if I should be doing this, but let me see if I can hold up the bowl of minis. Get all of them on top of here. So this is the gorgeous bowl here. And I really, if I was gonna knit another one, because this, I have the DK weight yarn. I don't even know where to put it. I was thinking of doing another one with the DK weight yarn in some of these. But I think I'm gonna save them for another pattern too, because I've always got more ideas than I can possibly knit and publish at once. But what you can see here is, I can't remember which one came, I think this one. Anyway, it was this was the pairing that is the 100 Acre Woods pairing. And then there were all the minis. So what you could do is you could kind of pick your favorite ones and pick a little palette. You certainly don't need to use all of them. And you could just highlight the ones that you want to use, and it would look gorgeous as you stagger them throughout. Now, as I'm looking at this, I'm also just reminding myself that so many of my patterns, if you have those minis, they're really good for it, because so much of what I design had to do with colors and interplay between yarns. So definitely, if you do not need to do any of my patterns in only 2 colors. Mix them in, use them up. You'll feel really good about using up your yarn, or, you know, getting to a special bundle that you have. So this is the one that I had done in the Making Tracks in the Farm Fresh. This is the DK weight yarn again. And if you watch the video about the cowl and its name and the inspiration, you'll see me hold this one up as well. And I know that they're going to be coming out with a sport weight yarn soon, which is really exciting because I think the sport weight yarn could look really beautiful for the fingering weight pattern. So here's how I'm going to wrap it up. That is what I'm working on. That is how it relates to this gauge conversation we've been having. And if you are still looking at the 700 fence posts patterns and wondering what you should get, you can get either pattern on its own. And I put out launch discounts, so there'll be a launch discount coming out for the fingering weight pattern when it releases. But what I've done is I've put them both into an ebook, and the ebook has a deeper discount than either pattern would have with a regular pattern release code, discount code. The ebook, I think it's 25% off essentially what the cost would be if you bought both patterns at full price. And the reason is there was still a lot of work that went into doing it twice, and modifications and test knitters and tech editing and all of the pieces. So really, so many of us designers, whether we're new or we've been around for a while, but we're not huge names doing thousands and thousands of patterns. I mean, most of us are trying to cover our tech editing costs. That's like the real world for you. So, you know, tech editing costs us money. Obviously the yarn to make these, in most cases, unless somebody's sponsoring you, the yarn is costing you money. This isn't even taking into consideration your hours. So we're certainly not looking to have that all funded. But if you're wondering, why do patterns cost what they cost? Well, if you want a good pattern that's been tech edited very thoroughly, that's been tested, and in some cases, a person has had a sample knit, even when it's an accessory, it still requires quite a bit of investment. And when you're looking at a sweater or a garment that's graded through 10 sizes, it's a very significant investment of time, no question about it, but financially as well for designers. So if you value a quality pattern that has had all of those pieces done, there might not be 50 projects in Ravelry for you to look at and know that it's been done well. But if you ask someone, has it been tech edited, has it been tested, you can find out and you can see how other people do rate it. So my last thing is I would ask you, if you are out there knitting and you want to do a favor and do a really nice thing for independent designers, if you can put your project pictures in Ravelry. I didn't realize what a small percentage of people do put their project pictures in, because I've done it since I was a new knitter. So it's just what I came up with. And I so value everybody's notes, and they might have notes and a pattern might be a really good pattern, but they have some notes that are just going to make it even better and more helpful to you. So if you like looking at other people's notes, especially, and you like discovering new designers and you value tech editing and you value testing, please consider putting pictures of your projects in and rating people's patterns and putting notes, because it really is so helpful. And all feedback is a gift, right? As long as you do it in the right way. If you have constructive feedback, that's also really helpful to designers. It's not really helpful when you just complain and put up a picture and put a sad face of how much you like the project. But if you do it in a way where you're trying to help someone, that can be really, really valuable as someone goes to. Feedback is a gift, and we all can use feedback to develop. So that leaves me with my last thought, which is always knit kindly, live kindly. Hope you've enjoyed this and it's opened your mind a little bit more about patterns and yarn pairing together and how you can modify with gauge and some interesting things you can do. And I hope you'll check out 700 Fence Posts Cowl, the story behind it, the pattern, and the ebook. And the ebook does give you a lot of information about what type of cowl you might want to knit, in what weight yarn, and which pattern you can follow, and what you might modify for gauge. So there's a whole bunch of frequently asked questions at the beginning. I don't know how frequently they are asked, but some of them have been, and it's how I can really help point you towards what's going to give you the best finished object that meets your expectations. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see your projects in Ravelry soon.